And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight someone who I've known for a long time. That's, well, true. Jeannie Garrard-Burnett, who's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I have known Jeannie, like I said, for a long time. She actually served on my dissertation committee. I won't say how long ago, but was a great help to me in writing about religion in Latin America. Though our topics are somewhat different in time period and in scope, Jeannie has a wide-ranging knowledge of religion in Latin America, and that's what she's going to talk to us about tonight, particularly Pentecostalism in Latin America, which is one of her specialties. She's written a number of books. The first one that she wrote was Protestantism in Guatemala. I got to get the subtitle right, so I got to look at the notes here. Living in the New Jerusalem. She recently published a book in 2010, Terror in the Land of the Holy Spirit, Guatemala under General Efrain Rios Montt, a widely acclaimed book. She is now working on a study of liberation theology of revolutionary American priests in Central America. She's edited so many volumes that there are too many to mention, so I won't mention them. But she's edited a number of volumes on religion in Latin America and Latin American history as well. It's a really great pleasure for me to welcome her here to St. John's St. Ben's. I know that she's going to give a wonderful talk, and I hope that you enjoy it and that you ask lots of good questions when she's finished. So with no further ado, Jeannie Garrard-Burnett.
Thank you so much, Brian. Get set up here. I was a little afraid of the mini mic. But it is a real treat to be here, a real honor to be here. We consider Brian Larkin to be one of our great successes. He's somebody that we're always proud to claim as one of the products of our history program, and he really has lived up to that. And so it really is a treat to be here. And so I am going to talk about Pentecostalism in Latin America, but I'm also going to talk about some changes in religiosity in Latin America in general, but they also have a lot to do with the Catholic Church, of course. I think it's interesting, when I first started looking at Protestantism and Pentecostalism in particular, people would say, well, how can you look at Pentecostalism without looking at Catholicism? And now people look at Pentecostalism without looking at Catholicism and vice versa. I mean, I think you really can't do that. So I've tried to remedy that a little bit here. But there was a book that came out in 1990. There were two big books that came out. One was called Tongues of Fire by David Martin, and the other was by David Stoll, and it was called Is Latin America Turning Protestant? And as I say, that was in 1990, and it was a book that really caught people off guard. And so you can decide for yourself at the end of this talk whether or not that is the case. But in 1990, scholars were really just beginning to notice that Latin America wasn't uniformly Catholic any longer. And I'm going to show more charts than I normally would tonight because the Pew Forum for Religion and Public Life, which is a wonderful think tank in Washington, a nonpartisan, non-religious think tank in Washington, conducted a study of Latin American religiosity that came out in November of this past year. And so their information is really quite up to date, and I think there'll be some things that may astonish and amaze you that they came up with. So I'll just start with that. And yeah, you can see them from here. So Latin America is obviously Roman Catholic. It obviously is that way in history and culture, and it remains so. But you can see here that has changed quite a bit over the past century. You can look at 1910 and you see that every single country in Latin America is at least 80-something% Catholic, and most of them are up in the high 90s. And then you look at 2014 and you can see that has changed quite dramatically. Particularly if you look at the Central American countries, you see that El Salvador is 50% Protestant, or 50% Catholic. Honduras is 46% Catholic. Guatemala is about 50%. And so you can see that these are major changes, right? And I will say that a lot of the figures that you find about religiosity in Latin America are not great. You have to sort of look at them carefully and use them carefully. But these are figures that I trust. As I said, these are nonpartisan. They're very meticulous in their methodology. And so I think these are probably pretty reliable figures. And so you can see this kind of speaks for itself. And I've got a few more things that sort of illustrate this too. And from the same study, that is, you can see share of Catholics decreasing in Latin America and Protestants and unaffiliated increasing. And so you can see that they're kind of moving toward each other, right, over the course of the last century or so. One of the things that I'm not going to talk about very much tonight is the number of unaffiliated people who register as such in national censuses in Latin America. We're not 100% sure what that means. It's either people who really are unaffiliated or they would have identified as Catholic in 1910. You know, that there was one thing to identify with and that's what you did, but it doesn't mean that they were active, that they were, you know, they were baptism and funeral Catholics. One of the other speculations is even though the percentage of Catholics has dropped precipitously, because there are other options on national censuses, I feel like that's a pointer, but that's actually a fly, I think, up there going around, or the Holy Spirit circulating. I don't know what it is, but anyway, that actually people who identify as Catholic, that 69%, actually may be real Catholics. People who actually are actively attend Mass and are practicing Catholics as opposed to nominal Catholics. So, you know, what this all means can vary a good bit. But the one thing that is absolutely true is the number of Protestants is way up. And then this just sort of beats you over the head with the same information, and that is, I've labeled it here, cradled Catholics and converts. You can see very clearly illustrated that the number of people who are born Catholic and are Catholic today has dropped by a good number of people, and that there's a much smaller number of people who were born Protestant but now have become Protestants. More Protestants are converts than are born in the churches. And the reverse is true with Catholics. And then there's that unaffiliated number, which we're still a little bit unsure about. And then this is, having said I really believe their statistics and their figures, I'm not so sure about this one. This certainly wouldn't be true for the place I've done most of my work, which is Guatemala, and it wouldn't be true for the place I've done the second amount of my work, which is Brazil. But Protestants in Latin America tend to be Pentecostals. And if you don't know yet what a Pentecostal is, you will by the end of this evening. They are not the historic mainline churches that sent missionaries into the region at the end of the 19th century. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they are Pentecostals. The reason I'm not so sure about this figure, which is 65% of Protestants being Pentecostals, in Guatemala, the number of Protestants who are Pentecostals, the percentage is more like 87%. That would also be true in El Salvador. It would also be true in Brazil. Overwhelmingly, Latin American Protestants are Pentecostal. And that has some very specific implications. And one of the arguments I'm going to make tonight is that there has been what I call a Pentecostalization of Latin American religion in churches that are not historically Pentecostal, including the Catholic Church. That it has, that is a Pentecostalizing force that continues to very dramatically alter the religious landscape in Latin America. So they come up with 65%, but I would say that that is a little bit low. So I love these pictures. That's a scary pirate on the right. But Latin America obviously is Roman Catholic in its culture and in its religion. You know, even if we go back to those first figures that I gave you, and you have a country that's 40% Protestant, which is high, it still means that 60% of the people in the country are Catholic, right? I mean, you can flip those numbers and it sort of makes it all look a little bit different. There are colonial links that Dr. Larkin has talked to you about in your classes between the church and the crown. And even though the Catholic Church underwent severe anti-clerical repression during a lot of the 19th century and a good bit of the 20th century. Popular Catholicism in many parts of Latin America is alive and well, and the institutional church is alive and well in many parts of it. And there are, people are just beginning to develop a literature about this, the idea of there being sort of a Catholic culture among Protestants, that some of the things we think of as being sort of intrinsically Latin American, also sort of pop up when people convert, regardless of what their religion is. I don't know how far that sort of line of thinking will go, but I think it's hard to overstate that. And Protestantism was something that in Latin America was considered to be a very hostile force. I know when I was first starting my own work on this, one of the things I found going back into the before the late 19th century, which is a period of time. I feel don't do any history before the invention of the typewriter. That's kind of, it's made my life a lot easier. But the place you find Protestants in the Spanish record are Inquisition records. And some of the people who show up in the Inquisition records are, believe it or not, they really are pirates. They're tried as heretics rather than as criminals, which is what pirates are. You know, we romanticize them, but they're criminals. They're rapists and murderers and bandits, but they're tried as heretics. And so you have this real firewall between Catholic Latin America and particularly the English-speaking Protestant nations. And it takes a long time before anybody bridges that firewall, no matter how much they try. But they do begin to try in the late 19th century. And those of you who have taken those Mexican history courses probably know who this guy on my right is, my far right. Anybody know? Anybody know? It's Benito Juarez, right? Who is liberal president of Mexico in the 1860s. He's actually president on and off a couple of times. He learned to read in the house of the Catholic priest, but he is sort of a classic liberal in the sense that he wants to modernize Mexico in a variety of different ways, including secularizing it, meaning that there are anti-clerical laws that go into effect under liberal government in Mexico and across the rest of Latin America. I'm just using Mexico as an example here, partly because Juarez tried two real innovations that didn't completely work out especially well for him. One is he tried to start a Mexican Catholic church, as sort of a Henry VIII kind of thing, starting one without tied it into Rome. Didn't work out particularly well, but it was, I suppose, worth a try. And then the other thing he did was to actively invite missionaries to come into Mexico. And what that was about was not that he was particularly keen on Protestants. In fact, I think, if anything, at best he probably felt neutrally about them. But in the midst of all the secularization, that is when they secularized things like cemeteries and especially schools and hospitals and literacy projects, which were things that liberals really valued, secular liberals really valued, particularly education and particularly infrastructure. But they removed the Catholic Church from overseeing those institutions, which is what they had always done. I mean, all education in Mexico at the beginning of the 19th century is a parochial education, right? Who's going to do it? The government? Maybe, but that's a very expensive proposition. And so they invite missionaries to come in to take those places. Now, Protestant missionaries in the late 19th century, which is when you begin to see a flow of missionaries coming from mainly the United States. I mean, they come from a few other places like England, but mainly from the United States. And I will say that some of the denominations are sort of loath to go to Latin America. Why would that be? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Because it's already Christian, right? Come on, this is a Catholic school. You should know that. But they want to go to places like the Middle East and the Orient, right, where people are not Christian at all. But of course, for particularly what will eventually become the fundamentalist denominations, they don't consider Catholic countries to be Christian. All right, so they've got no real qualms about it. Other ones are sort of more equivocal. But they're all mainline denominations. That is, they're Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Anglicans. They're not Baptists do become fundamentalist. This is before that modernist fundamentalist divide, which takes place in the early 20th century. Don't want to get too much into that. But they're coming out of a very traditional Protestant background, and they bring a lot with them. They do bring exactly what, I'm going to my next slide, even though I've got imperialism up there, and I want to explain that a little bit. At this point, they tend to be very involved in the social gospel movement, and so they want to see improvements in everyday life in Latin America. They're particularly interested in education. And why would Protestants be so interested in education? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
Bible.
Yeah, got to be able to read the Bible. You are responsible for your own salvation, your individual salvation, and if you can't read, you can't read the Bible. So there they are. They're big advocates of education. They also end up putting in a lot of hospitals, clinics, literacy projects, translation projects. That's one of the things, particularly in countries with a lot of indigenous languages like Guatemala or Ecuador or Peru. There had not been any dictionaries. There hadn't been any grammar books since Spanish Catholic friars in the 16th and 17th century had compiled those, mainly the 16th century. So it's not until the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century that you have people putting together these dictionaries for indigenous languages and actually teaching them, treating them like they're real languages worthy of sort of formal discourse. And so it's rare in Latin America, almost any country, that you go there and you don't today see, the evangelical hospital. And let me say right now that the word evangelico in Spanish and Portuguese means Protestant. It doesn't mean an evangelical like it would mean in English, which is a very specific kind of Protestant Christian. But you see the evangelical hospital, and you'll often see a long-established school, a reputable school that missionaries established. So they were really good with institution building. And they played a role that sort of belied their numbers in terms of sort of having connections with developmentally oriented governments and for starting these kinds of projects and paying for them themselves, which liberal governments really liked. What they were not so successful about, and I think for the reason I'll get into a little bit, is they weren't very successful in making converts. Nobody wanted to convert. One of the reasons is because they had a very cultural idea of what converting to Protestantism meant. It was very much encoded in the ideas, sort of the culture of the United States. And when you go into the sort of literature that they use in their schools, and on the one hand you think, oh, come on, have a clue. It's kind of ridiculous because I can give you an example. In the 6 months after the Spanish-American War in 1898, which ended in December of 1898, there were 28 different Protestant denominations that sent missionaries to Cuba to start large-scale projects. That's a lot. Right, and they were particularly interested in trying to create sort of a new type of Latin American citizen that wasn't sort of caught up in 19th century liberal conservative struggles and Catholic culture, that they would be sort of modern and American and Protestant and American style, that maybe Cuba would eventually be, even though it was against the law, that Cuba would become another state. And you wanted a good Protestant ethic, sort of well-educated population to be a part of that. So they brought down things like, they translated books like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm and Black Beauty and these sort of wholesome American books. They translated McGuffey's Readers in their totality to be used in Cuban schools. And if you've ever run across a McGuffey's Reader, they're actually kind of a lot of fun because they've got things like George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and sort of illuminating Aesop's fables and harvesting maple syrup in Vermont. You think, what are these Cuban kids thinking when they're reading McGuffey's Reader in Havana, in 1900? But there they are, because it's about creating a different kind of person. And so, in a certain way, no wonder they didn't convert anybody. It's really remarkable. if you look at national censi in 1960s, there's not a single, 1960, the year, not a single Latin American country that has more than 5% of a Protestant population. And you can assume in that case, even in that little bitty 5%, that some of those people are, American businessmen, foreigners who've moved in and they go to the Lutheran church or whatever it is. They're not even natives of the place. So in terms of, the way the missionaries talk about it in his early prayers, they say we're planting the seeds for the harvest later. And I guess they'd be really pleased because now they've got a harvest. But it took a long time. Anybody know what that says? Yes?
Like in this place, this house, we're Catholics. We don't accept propaganda of other religions.
God bless this house, yeah. In this house, we're Catholics, and take your Protestant propaganda elsewhere. And then God bless us. You can still see these up. There are plenty of them around today. But certainly that's the attitude. There's a religious outlook that is sort of impermeable to Protestantism, but there's also a cultural one. And then things change in the 1960s rather abruptly. And as you know, the 1960s are a period of substantial change across the board. Religious change, cultural change, political change, it's all over the place. And I'm sure you know that 1959, January of 1959, is when Fidel Castro took over in Cuba, which just sends shock waves all over the Americas, all over the world, because heretofore the thinking was that communism was an old world phenomenon. It was something that happened in Europe, in Middle Europe, and by the 1940s in Asia. But it wasn't going to happen in the Americas. There had been that little incident in Guatemala in 1954 that had been preempted by a CIA-backed coup. But after the Cuban Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution, it's mellowed over the years, but it was not friendly to any religion. And in fact, practicing Christians were put in, they were called lacra social, social scum, and they were put in camps in the 1960s. That's changed a lot over time. But initially, it's a very conventional opiate of the masses sort of outlook about religion in Cuba. And as I say, that does change. A good bit over time, but it's pretty militant there at the beginning. And so there's this great concern, a political concern, but also a religious concern that Latin America, all of it, the domino theory is going to fall, and Latin America is going to become communist just like Cuba has. And so there are all kinds of preemptive measures that go into effect. We talked about some in Dr. Larkin's class today that were sort of political remedies. But one of the things that you see in Latin America is North American evangelicals, and this time I mean real evangelicals, who tend to be very politically conservative. They launch a series of evangelization waves in Latin America that utilize the new technologies of the day. That is, they use these, back in American Protestant culture, there had been these tent revivals that would be held out on the frontier and in rural areas, and someone would come in for maybe a week and meet in a tent, and people would come down in the front and be saved, and people would sing hymns, and people would get kind of fired up about that. Well, it's after World War II, there's actually Billy Graham who says, you could have a tent revival in a giant stadium, and instead of getting 100 people in there, you could have 50,000 people in there. And then you could put it on TV, and then you could have 1 million people watch it. And so Billy Graham becomes the first genuine televangelist. Not as heinous as some, but anyway, he's the one who starts it all off. And in fact, there he is. It's also the point where you see, not missionaries, but evangelists from the United States going to Latin America and having these big stadium-style revivals. And what they're talking about is evangelical Protestantism as a spiritual alternative to communism. This is what they're talking about, that this is a way to spiritually fend off communism. And they also begin to use, any of y'all ever heard of fuller brushes? I can't even imagine this myself, but one of the big evangelical seminaries is called Fuller Theological Seminary, and the money from that came from this brush company where people would go door to door and sell brushes. I can't imagine buying a brush from a door-to-door salesman, but they use that tactic to evangelize, like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons do today, right? And so this becomes surprisingly, the order of the day in Latin America, and you see them in almost every country, these large-scale revivals. And for a variety of reasons, it catches on for the first time. And I think it partly has to do with the American associations, people who are hostile to the idea of some sort of Cuban-style takeover. They see the United States as sort of the hegemon that's going to keep that from happening, and these missionaries are part of that. The missionaries themselves see themselves as part of that. But there's more to it as well, and that is one of the things that happens is you see the formation by the mid-1960s of a lot of local Protestant churches for the first time. They're not associated with missionaries. A lot of them are breakaway churches from old missionary denominations. The missionaries themselves, I don't mean these evangelicals, but the mainliners that I mentioned earlier, they're beginning to nationalize in the early 1960s, because what they don't want to happen is what's happened to them in places like China, which had scads of missionaries from all denominations, had happened in Cuba, and that is when the communists take over, they throw the missionaries out. You know, and then what do you do, right? So they nationalize. They turn over their churches, and they turn over the administration of the churches mainly to local people. And one of the peculiar things that happens is within a few years, and it's an interesting process, but within a few years, the local churches Pentecostalize. Now, they may not change their name, but they change their liturgy, and they change their whole approach to spirituality. They become Pentecostalized churches. This picture over here on my right is a church called Iglesia Evangelica Elim, which is, this is the year it was founded in San Salvador in 1977, which is a rough time in El Salvador. And you can see that they're basically meeting, and it looks like kind of a barn or a warehouse or something. It is now the single largest congregation in the Americas, and that includes North America. Even something like Joel Osteen's church, or one of these huge mega churches isn't as big as this church. It's got 250,000 members who show up. I mean, they kind of run services all day long because to accommodate that many people. And then you can see here that there is a very dramatic increase in Pentecostalism in Latin America between 1960 and, 2020. I don't believe we're there yet, but you get the idea. It's a projection, obviously. Probably, I don't know if it's optimistic or not, but you can see that it is really quite a dramatic increase. And then the other piece of this is not only are they Pentecostal, but they are local. Now, you may find the largest denomination in Latin America is the Catholic Church, but the second largest denomination is the Assemblies of God. But the way, which is a Pentecostal denomination, it has its origin in the United States, but the Assemblies of God operates like a franchise, and that is a pastor actually buys his church building, and there's a body of dogma that comes with it, but it's pretty inspecific. That is, it has certain points you need to hit, but beyond that, you're on your own. And so it lends a sort of plasticity to Assembly of God worship that you can sort of mold to conform to a given place. And I think that that's one of the reasons why these churches are so popular, although we'll talk about their popularity and a bit more. So what else happens in the early 1960s is Vatican II. And this is not unrelated to the growth of Protestantism, of course. I mean, Andrew Chestnut, who's very Picasso and one of our colleagues in religious studies who loves to be incendiary, but he calls the Second Vatican Council, this will make some of your skin crawl, he calls it the Catholic Church's membership retention strategy. But it's opening the church to the world, of course. But one of the things that within Latin America that really resonated, and there's been all kinds of ecclesiological debate over what this meant, but actually Pope John the 23rd in 1959, before, I guess, about the time this chapel here was built, he began to use the phrase separated brethren to refer to Protestants. And then there's this Vatican document that comes out that talks about Protestants as separated brethren. And certainly my impression from talking to a lot of Protestants in Latin America, a lot of Pentecostals over a long period of time who were converts from Catholicism, this was something that seemed revelatory to them. Because if you're going to sort of fool around with another religious expression, it's better to be a separated brethren than a heretic. You know, that has a very different meaning to it. And so this is something that Latin American Protestants are very, they may not know anything else about Vatican II, but they know about separated brethren. It makes a big difference to them. And I think that that is part of what happens in the 1960s. I don't think that was the intention of it at all either, but there you go. So, to talk a little bit, I'm sorry the Pentecostals are so pixelated in this picture, but I just couldn't get a better one. I want to talk about what Pentecostalism is. And, you know, I'm assuming a lot of you know a good bit about Catholicism, and some of you know about liberation theology, which I'm going to touch on here a little bit because I think it's also related. But I want you to, as I talk about this, I want you to think in your mind about how, I'm not talking about charismatic Catholicism. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'm talking about old school Catholicism or post-conciliar Catholicism. Okay, so Pentecostalism it places an emphasis on the third person of the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit, right? And so every Pentecostal worth their salt experiences a baptism of the Holy Spirit, which is an experience of the presence of God. And it's manifest in somatic ways, that it's in your body. And there are a variety of different ways that Pentecostals experience this. And one of the, I guess, most popular ways is speaking in tongues, which if it comes out of the book of Acts, that's where the term comes from. And in the actual biblical description, if you remember that, when they're all in this room, all depressed, and the Holy Spirit descends on them, and they go out and they speak different languages, and the people in the crowd say, "Are these men drunk?" And they said, "No, it's 9 o'clock in the morning." Obviously, they're not University of Texas students. Just kidding. But they're speaking in known languages, actually, in the book of Acts. That is, suddenly they can speak languages that they couldn't speak before. But speaking in tongues is, somebody's described it as a language of everyone and no one. It's a glossolalia, it's sometimes called. It's a speaking in an unknown tongue. And so it's this ecstatic speech. One of the gifts of the Spirit that Pentecostals talk about is the ability to interpret when someone else speaks in tongues, so it isn't just babble. Sometimes, certainly in Latin America, divine healing plays a large part in Pentecostalism. That is, somebody will have something wrong with them, and often they'll go to a variety of different healers, right? They may go to the Puesto de Salud, they may go to a variety of different churches. They may go to a shaman. They may go to some folk deity, but they go to a Pentecostal church and they believe they're healed. Some of them are measurably healed. I'll leave that to you how that is. But that's one of the somatic experiences of baptism in the Spirit. Ecstatic behavior like laughing in the Spirit or being slain in the Spirit, where pastor comes up and boom, you're on the ground. There are all kinds of different bodily experiences of the Holy Spirit that Pentecostals feel that they have, and that's how you know you've had baptism in the Spirit. And it differs from mainline Protestantism in that mainline Protestants talk about it's off there, but sola scriptura, only Scripture. That's the source of divine revelation. Only, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so, right? Well, this is about your body feeling God, right? Now, I mentioned liberation theology a minute ago, and I'll say something about it in another minute, but what is one of the key elements of liberation theology? It involves a lot of intellect. You have the hermeneutic circle where you read the Bible, you apply it, you discuss it, and then you act it out in your life. It involves a lot of intellectual bandwidth. Pentecostalism isn't about and I don't say this to insult them, but it's not about the intellect. It's about the Holy Spirit's involvement in your body. And I think that that's one of the things that really distinguishes it. It's particularly attractive if you experience divine healing in a place where there's terrible health care, minimal access to doctors, and particularly if you live in a place that has been sort of terrible. Now, I'm going to mention that's sort of terrible in just a minute, but I do want to mention briefly, and then we'll come back to it later. There is a parallel movement that does come together with Pentecostalism that appears actually in the United States in the 1960s, late 1960s, and that is the charismatic movement, which some of you might be familiar with. It shows up at Duquesne University. It shows up in the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, Lutheran Church, and some of the other mainline Protestant denominations. And it's basically baptism of the Holy Spirit outside of Pentecostal denominations. Okay, and one of the things that I didn't, because I was afraid I didn't have time, and I probably don't have time, but I didn't talk about sort of the modern origins of Pentecostalism in the early 20th century, but when it does sort of kick off in the first decade of the 20th century in Los Angeles at the Azusa Street Revival, it's a place where there are racial mixtures and mixtures of languages, spoken literal languages, and of genders. Women are active in the Pentecostal revival. But because of that, and it's led by a man named William Seymour, who's African American, and he brings in lots of elements from the black church into Pentecostalism. And so it has sort of a seedy, transgressive quality in the United States. And so once it sort of shows up in Latin America, it has it was a religion for the dispossessed in the United States, and it's a religion of the dispossessed in Latin America, at least initially. Charismatic religion, which is very, very similar, nonetheless has a little bit more cachet to it. For example, in the Brazilian Catholic Church, charismatic movement is very, very popular, and it's kind of an upper class thing. It's something upper class women get involved with. So they're not terribly different, but they do appeal to sort of different types of people. But I want to get to that a little bit later. Okay, so we can look at the 1970s to the 1990s as being this period, and the literature calls it the Pentecostal boom. If you know your history, you know that this is a rough time in Latin America. It's particularly the 70s and 80s. There are military dictatorships in almost every country. There are dirty wars going on throughout Central America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. If we went back to that chart I showed you to begin with, all of those except Argentina have very high Pentecostal populations. I don't think that's unrelated. Certainly, I know in my own research in Guatemala, one of the things that really appealed to people in the 1970s and 1980s is the eschatology, the idea that Jesus was coming soon, and that the tribulations they were living in, and Pentecostalism really picks up in Guatemala after this big earthquake in 1976. So they're living through the horrific times described in the book of Revelation, and so they have fire, pestilence, famine, earthquake, horsemen of the apocalypse, which are actually in army tanks in green uniforms. And it makes sense to them. That it creates a narrative that makes sense of terrible suffering. And so that's appealing to people. I love that picture because it's everybody sort of being raised up in the rapture there, if you can see it there. That is something that has sort of, after the turn of the century, there were a lot of Pentecostals who thought the year 2000 was the end of days. Well, it wasn't, obviously, because here we are 15 years later. And so the sort of, that end time focus has dissipated, I think, not completely, but it certainly doesn't have the same emphasis that it has. And times are better in Latin America, generally speaking, than they were back in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, and these terrible tribulations that people were going through, not to say there are not terrible problems now, there are, but they're not on the scale that they were back then, and so that part's receded. Now the other part is, it was a counterpoint in some ways to liberation theology, which is also in its heyday in the 1970s, right? Now certainly there's a lot of scholarship that talks about Pentecostals being very politically conservative, and that's a counterpoint to radical Catholics, right? My observation is the research doesn't bear that out, that it's kind of a trope, it's something that people, you know, put in these binaries, but in fact it doesn't actually bear out. I knew people who were Pentecostals and were members of the guerrilla in Guatemala and El Salvador both, so it certainly doesn't break down as easily as that. I mean, you can sort of, you know, almost every stereotype has some basis in fact, but I think by and large that's a stereotype. On the other hand, liberation theology required a lot of you. It required a lot. It required you to put your life on the line if you were really serious about it. And a lot of people paid that price. So there certainly was a perception, if it wasn't a reality, that being a Protestant was safer. It's kind of a trench warfare. I have also talked to plenty of people in Guatemala who said, you know, why did you convert? And they said, well, the priest kept talking about, you know, standing up for social justice and, you know, sort of going out to help the community. And I want to know, you know, when the Army came in and killed my children, what happened to my children? Are my children in heaven? I want to be in heaven with my kids. So, you know, it's a different way, certainly, of looking at things. So, let me move forward a bit. And I want to talk a little bit about what sociologists of religion and religious studies people and even historians say are the reasons why people convert to Protestantism and Pentecostalism in particular. If you've read in your sociology classes, you've read Max Weber. He talks a lot. He's written the famous book called Protestantism in the Spirit of Capitalism. And then he talks about how there's a certain affinity between Protestantism and capitalism. So that's an economic factor. In Guatemala, they call that del suelo al cielo, which means from the dirt floor to heaven, meaning that the perception is that you may have more money if you're a Protestant. You may be better off economically, and I'm going to get in just a second to why that might be. They also talk about, anthropologists, people themselves don't talk about this, but what they call a Catholic cultural tax. If you belong to a religious brotherhood, that's very expensive. If you live in a Maya village and you pay into that, you pay into it your whole life, and at the end of your life, it's a very different way of looking at things. But you literally pay into belonging to the brotherhood, and at the end of your career in a religious brotherhood, traditionally, you would spend all your money on a final fiesta, which affirms the community. You'd be broke by the end of it, but then the community takes care of you, right? And in a sort of early capitalist society, that works well. But what happens when the Pentecostals don't take part in the fiestas? And believe me, they don't take part in the fiestas. They'll do anything. You ought to see them during Holy Week. They're just practically screaming in their houses because you know the whole country's taken over by Holy Week, which they don't really pay any attention to. So it's a fairly well-defined economic system that gets thrown way off if those Protestants are actually spending that money to invest in maybe fertilizer instead of paying for a fiesta. So there's a perception of new access to a middle class or even upper class, which in fact, when you look at the figures, isn't as true as you might think it is. Protestants don't actually seem to make more money than everybody else, but the perception is that they do. Now, one of the things that is different is that Protestants in Latin America, Pentecostals or anybody else, they don't drink alcohol. That's one of the things that really marks them apart from the Catholic world. And in fact, that 5% I mentioned to you in 1960, I remember I was given a paper one time, Rick Adams said, well, who are they? Who are those Protestants? And I thought, well, that's a really good question. And they were drunks and adulterers, is who they were. They were people who had really been marginalized from society. And if you had a problem with alcohol and you have a community that really sort of valorizes that through community celebrations that are centered around alcohol, what are you going to do if you actually are an alcoholic? You become a Protestant. But anyway, they don't drink alcohol, and that does cut way down on lots of social problems. One of them is family violence. Drops dramatically when the guy quits drinking. Another thing is if you're a poor person, those of you who've been on that study abroad in Guatemala, and I know you're all under 21, so you would not know the answer to this question, but just hypothetically, if you were to know the answer to this question, how much does a beer cost in Guatemala? Oh, I know you know. You can't fool me. Yeah, I'm talking about Gallo, you know. It's about 7 quetzales, you know, about 7 quetzales. What is the daily wage for an agricultural worker? Anybody know that? About 7 quetzales. So it's a day wage for a beer, meaning you drink something else. you drink homebrew. But still, I mean, that's a lot of money if, you know, that's a lot. That is a huge percentage of your income. And so you quit drinking, it is going to make a difference, right? And presumably you would invest that in something else. And actually the Catholic Church has recognized this and is trying, I mean, when you use wine in your service, you can't eschew alcohol completely, but they've really tried to cut back on, you know, sort of tamping down the community fiestas. I had a friend who used to be a priest in Alta Verapaz, and he was talk about, this actually is a factor in it, but he was responsible for 54 parishes. One guy, 54 parishes. I said, not much pastoral care there, I'm thinking, but he said, you know, people used to give him a drink, and now they gave him coffee, and he said he'd just come home so wired, you know. He said it was actually better just to have a little sip, but anyway. That certainly is one of the point of 54 parishes, too, that is not to be overlooked, is Catholic Church in Latin America, like everybody else, has had a serious priest shortage for a long time. And, you know, Protestants do tend to be evangelical in the American sense. So if you have, you know, if you have 30 priests in Guatemala City, and they're out there, you know, ministering to people, that's 30 priests. But if you have a Protestant church that has, I don't know, 500 members, and all of those people are going out, well, there they are. They're right there. And certainly during the war, and this was true in El Salvador too, when people would move in from the countryside, they would provide, it's a free place to go, that will kind of look out for you. It's a new way of forming community. And you could certainly do that in the Catholic Church, and a lot of people do. But they quickly acquired a demographic advantage. I don't want to go too far over my time. One of the factors is, too, that local pastors are local pastors, and so they have the same habitus, they have the same spiritual worldview, the same life view that people in their congregations have. And so, and certainly in the Maya communities, this is actually a town I did some work in, I'm sorry it's pixelated too, but it's an almost 100% Maya Protestant town. But it's also a town where they believe in mountain spirits and the power of Mashimon, who we saw in that class today, a Maya deity who's got sort of a semi-Catholic veneer. And where missionaries would come in and say, oh, come on, people, you don't believe this stuff. You know, that's an idol, and that's just wrong. The experience of everybody in these towns is those things are absolutely real. You see this in Brazil too. One of the sort of critical points of conversion is people are afraid of the African gods that they encounter in Umbanda and Candomblé. And missionaries would say that's ridiculous, that doesn't mean anything. But local pastors say that's absolutely real, that's Satan. And so you need to counteract that per se. And so that also gives them a cultural in that they didn't have before. Now in the 1980s, in 1990s, you see the expansion of these kinds of churches, which are something new, and they are prosperity theology oriented churches, which are the idea that God will manifest His blessing to you through material well-being. That is the, I mean, it couldn't be more different than liberation theology. You want a counterpoint to liberation theology, but literally, if you, they call it a word faith doctrine, that is, you name what you want, and the power of God is such that He will give you what you want. Jim Baker, who was a prominent American televangelist at one point, said, you know, when you ask the Lord for a camper, be sure and tell Him what color you want. It's the absolute surety that you will get what God has promised you. He's promised you life abundant, and that means the stuff that goes with it. You know, and people should be able to see on you that you are blessed by your mode of dress, by your prosperity. You should drive a nice car, you should have a nice job, because God gave them to you. And this is a very, it's a very clear trend in North American Pentecostalism, and it's also in Latin American Pentecostalism. This church here is, after the Assembly of God, the third fastest growing church in the world. It's a Brazilian denomination called the Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus. Talk about an aspirational name, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, right? And they have churches all over the world. I don't know if they have them in Minnesota. They very well might. One of the things, if you see that heart with a dove in it, anytime, Central America, they're not allowed to use this name because the other Pentecostals have shut them out. So they call themselves Comunidad de Dios. But once you see that emblem, you know it's the IURD. There's one of their churches, and just this fall they opened up a huge Temple of Solomon in Sao Paulo, which is supposed to be their St. Peter's Cathedral. It's supposed to be their own. They actually will call it the Pentecostal Vatican, and there it is. It's supposed to be an exact replica of Solomon's Temple. How they know, I could not tell you how, that the lighting is even supposed to be like in Solomon's Temple. But anyway, it is an incredibly wealthy church, and it is an incredibly popular church. They are all over the world now. And they're kind of hidden in plain sight. They're all over. It's interesting to me that when you cross over from Mexico into the United States on the Texas border, in every border town, from the Mexican side, you can see a McDonald's, a Walmart, and an IURD church. That's what you see right when you're about to cross into the United States, even though it's a Brazilian and not an American denomination. So those are the sociologists' reasons why people leave the Catholic Church, but these are ordinary people's reasons for why they leave the Catholic Church. And you can see that there are different kinds of reasons, right? It's interesting to me, I was so surprised to see this because you hear about prosperity gospel and you know about the IURD, but you see that only 14% of the people in there, despite Max Weber said they left the Catholic Church for seeking a better financial future. That's not the reason why they say. Seeking a personal connection to God, enjoying a style of worship at a new church, wanted greater emphasis on morality, found churches that help members more, outreach by church. You can see that, but the main reasons are those first four. Right? So they're not at all actually what scholars had thought it was. And people may be responding to in the way they feel like the interviewer wants them to respond, but Pew's pretty good about really asking questions that elicit the answers that are honest. So I just thought that was kind of fascinating. I'm running out of time here. Catholic responses to under the last two popes to the Pentecostal boom, of course there have been some, and the response of both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict were to be as Catholic as possible, to be the most Catholic Catholics they could possibly be. And so you see promotion of very traditional and conservative values, certainly an about-face from liberation theology, an emphasis on Marian devotions, which is something I want to come back to in the little time we have left. You see the appointment of Opus Dei bishops and the promotion of conservative Catholic movements like Opus Dei all over Latin America. And in fact, Jorge Bergoglio was one of the few non-Opus Dei cardinals in Latin America at the time he was elected Pope. So, but here's the big one, and that is what they call Catholic Pentecostals. That is Catholic Charismatic Renewal, which is something that really is much more grassroots-oriented than a top-down movement. 1992, Pope John Paul II gave it canonical recognition, but he wasn't wild about it, and Pope Benedict really wasn't very wild about it. But it's the fastest growing sector of Latin American Catholicism, by far. And seminaries that sort of, I don't want to say cater to it, but aren't hostile to it, are the seminaries, the Catholic seminaries in Latin America that are full. So it is the thing that is making a difference. It's a Pentecostalized sort of Catholicism. So it has a strong emphasis on the Holy Eucharist, which Pentecostals don't have, and devotion to the Virgin Mary, which Pentecostals don't have. And so if you're a Latin American Catholic, you can have best of both worlds if you want it. And so that's why it, I think that's why it appeals so much. But this I thought was super interesting because it's another one of the Pew reports, and that is, look at people who have experienced speaking in tongues, praying for miraculous healing, prophesying, which is something that happens in Pentecostal church. It says more common in Protestant churches and in Catholic churches, and I thought, well, duh. But on the other hand, look there, particularly if you get to the bottom of this list, how many Catholics, percentage-wise, have experienced these things that are Pentecostal manifestations, baptism of the Holy Spirit? I mean, look in Dominican Republic, 77% of Catholics have had a charismatic experience, right? 59% in Panama, 59% in Guatemala. I mean, you know, you can just sort of go down there, and so you can see it is something very prevalent in Latin American Catholicism, and I would say probably becoming more so. Okay, now people begin to talk about the Francis effect. You finally have a Latin American Pope. Lord knows it's taken long enough. And he is certainly his own man. You've all noticed that, I'm guessing, right? And so his, I don't think you call it tenure, his papacy coincides with the possible, certainly the tapering out of the Pentecostal boom. It's not that people aren't converting to Pentecostalism anymore, but for the last, I want to say, close to 10 years, they haven't been converting in the numbers that they once did. And then you have Pope Francis, who is very appealing to Catholics and non-Catholics alike. He brings a Latin American worldview and concerns to his papacy. And certainly, I know I've talked to, in Pentecostal sectors, they have, one of the things they really emphasize is growth. The size of a church makes a big difference to them. And so they have people they call, it's sort of a Spanish pun, Iglesia Crecimiento Specialist, church growth specialist, sort of cute. But I remember probably 20 years ago, somebody said, you know, and this was an avid church growth specialist, and he said, you know, there's just a limit to how many Latin Americans are actually going to be Protestants. You know, at a certain point, it's just not an infinite number of people. And he said, sooner or later, we're going to kind of hit that ceiling. And it's possible that they're close to that. Although, you know, by this time you have people who are second and even third generation Pentecostals. But here's the other piece of it, and that is in other studies, this wasn't part of the Pew report, one of the things, there are people who go back to the Catholic Church as well. And I'm not just saying it because I'm here at St. John's University. People go back. And the reason people almost universally give for going back to the Catholic Church after they've been a Pentecostal or a mainline Protestant for a while is her, Virgin Mary. They miss her. They miss Mary. They just miss the heck out of her. And after they've been gone for a while, they just can't stand it anymore, and they go back. And so, you know, in that sort of gross religious marketplace theory, you know, they refer to her, the Blessed Virgin Mary as Catholicism's unique marketing proposition. It's the thing that is unique. So I know we're kind of out of time, but I do want to, maybe if somebody could help me get this. There's a little bit of, I wanted to show you some charismatic Catholics in Brazil who are being led in a charismatic service by a very popular priest by the name of Marcelo Rossi, who is he's known as Brazil's singing priest. And if you need to go, you can see you have to go sort of 5 minutes into it. And I don't mean to take all of our question time, but I think you'll enjoy. Well, he's actually he's outside because they can't even fit into a building. And he's got YouTube videos, he's got albums, he's got awesome vestments that I think he's painted himself. Yeah, yeah, that's good enough. I just wanted to get to the sort of the heart of it. Is there a place we can turn it up? I don't think we can hear.
Mais uma vez!
It's a big, I mean, I think it's 300,000 people here.
Seu exército poderoso é, sua glória será vista em toda a terra. Despertar o canto da vitória, glória a Deus, vencemos toda arma contra nós perecerá, perecerá. O nosso general é Cristo. Os teus passos, nenhum inimigo nos resistirá, resistirá. Nosso general é Cristo, seguimos os teus passos, nenhum inimigo nos resistirá. Messias, marchando-se, sua mão, a chave da nos leva a possuir a terra prometida. Vamos cantar o canto da glória a Deus, vencemos toda arma contra
See, there's a kind of warehouse. There's a lot of people.
nosso general é Cristo. Seguimos os teus passos.
So that is, I've run out of time, but my point is, I don't know that Latin America is becoming Protestant, like the book suggests, but it definitely is becoming Pentecostalized. Regardless of where you are in it and who you are, it is. It is that. So, thank you.
We do have time for questions.
Yes.
So you said a lot of people are returning to traditional Catholicism because of Mary. Is there a percentage that you know?
I don't know if a percentage. There are just beginning to be some studies about it. In fact, the first person to do it was a Benedictine priest, and I thought, oh yeah, you got an axe to grind in this. But he did a series of surveys, and sure enough, that was overwhelmingly why people went back to the Catholic Church. I mean, there are more people leaving the Catholic Church than going back to it. But people coming back in the back door is something that people are really just starting to look at in a systematic way. But the thing that's so striking about it is they all come back for one reason. No other. That's it. And I think in a charismatic parish, if you were already Pentecostal for a while, Like I said, you can have it. You can have both. And then, one of the reasons, Marcelo Rossi is, he's all over the place. You can have your pick of videos of his, but I wanted to show you that one because they've got they're marching the monstrance around, so they're really emphasizing the Eucharist in a way that Pentecostals never would. And I think that probably would be another reason, but I think far and away it's the Virgin Mary. So, yeah.
How many of these Protestants, when they are Protestant if they also go to Mass?
That's a good question, because it's very common in Latin America for people to be two things at the same time. For example, you might be, if you're Brazilian, you might very well be Catholic and also be Umbandista, and go and practice Afro-Brazilian religions, but they don't. If you're a Protestant, you're just a Protestant. Because one of the things is, and I've always wondered, talk about marketing strategies, it always seemed like sort of a bad idea to me because they, particularly missionaries, used to just do terrible Catholic bashing. They were really Catholicophobic, in a lot of their discourse. And you think, well, no wonder nobody converted because everybody you're talking to is Catholic. That's not going to go over so well. And it didn't. But people tend not to do both. The other thing is that the evangelical, the Pentecostal churches in particular, are hostile to, I'm trying to nuance this in some of my work, but by and large, rhetorically, they're very hostile to folk religion, which they associate with Catholicism, even though it's as Catholic as you want to say it is, But they say that, those also they practice something they call spiritual warfare, which is, I could talk about this for another hour, but they identify problems in an area as being the fault of demonic forces, and they do this thing called spiritual mapping, where they map out what the demon of a particular place is, and then they cast it out. In the case of Almalonga, which I showed a minute ago, there was a Maya god there who's actually, it's a San Simon who's in the next town, and they tell about this. This town is a very exotic conversion story because there was a pastor in the late 1970s who, he told me the story himself, not in the late 1970s, but he said he went out to walk on the street and Jesus came before him, and he said, and he was just as real as you are right now, okay? And told them that there were these demons that needed to be cast out, and so they had these very dramatic exorcisms, and people were sort of thrown across the room by these spirits and threw up green, and the whole exorcism thing. But the neighboring town is still, they say, in the thrall of this Mayan god. But the curious thing about this town is it's very Maya. They speak Che, they don't speak Spanish. You can see that, well, I'll go back to it, even though it's a kind of not a very good picture. See if I can get back to it. Well, it's not maybe worth it. You can, there it is. So they've got their Jesus is Lord of Almalonga sign as you go into town, and one of the things that happened is it is actually, they say it's a city of miracles, and their agricultural productivity has gone up, fourfold. They also use a lot of fertilizer that the Catholic Action introduced, actually. But they are very proud of being Maya. They say that they've broken that equation that to be indigenous is to be poor, and they aren't poor. They still wear their traje, their traditional clothing, speak their languages. They closed down their jail and made it into a community center because they don't need it anymore. And in fact, compared to the neighboring town, their social statistics are remarkably higher. They have better health, better education, better sewer systems because they've spent their money on that. It's been kind of a self-fulfilling miracle in a certain sense. When they believe in the town, it's because they've had this sort of mass conversion. They've got something like 28 different evangelical churches there. They also had, their Catholic priest was a guy named Tomas Garcia, who was a very active liberation theology priest back in the 70s, and Maya himself. and he got sort of sent into clerical exile. It was like the worst place he could have gotten sent at the end of his life, and he died a couple of years ago. But I thought, talk about the place you wouldn't want to be, and his, everything about it would have been sort of horrible for him. But they have kind of threaded the needle. They've said, this is why we're a prosperous town. This is why we do well in this town. And when I was in Guatemala about 3 years ago, they had a terrible mudslide that came right down this, and it's on the mountainside. And this mudslide came down the mountainside and killed a bunch of people and wiped out a bunch of businesses in the main part of town. And so I got to go back a few months later, and it was sort of rude, but I wanted to see how did they read this? If they believe that they were under a special blessing, what happens when half the town gets wiped out by a mudslide? And so I went there, and to my surprise, it was almost completely rebuilt. And they said, well, just because God loves you doesn't mean you won't have hard times. And they just sort of, and there they were. So it had certainly stuck with them. But they would never be both. I mean, that's one thing. When you're an evangelico, you're generally speaking just an evangelico. But by the same token, the fact that you might have believed in the mountain spirits before you converted doesn't mean you don't believe in them now. It's just you reinterpret who they are. And that's a piece of it that I think is really important. They're still real. They're still entities in your life. But now you understand them to be fallen angels or demons. And so you have a different relationship with them. Yes, ma'am.
Do you see any attempt now for active ecumenical dialogue between the churches?
There is some. It was hard when they were so ardently anti-Catholic. The Catholic Church for a long time just thought of them as kind of gnats. Just they'll never make any inroads, and then they did. But it's mainly with the mainline Protestants who, as I say, they aren't nearly anywhere near as numerous as the Pentecostals, but they are still sort of institutionally important. They have good networks and good connections, and they're much more willing to connect. And they have been for a long time. I mean, during the civil wars in Central America, there were ecumenical groups involved in social justice. For example, in Nicaragua, the Baptists and Presbyterians were very involved in sort of advising some of the Sandinista programs and that sort of thing. So that sort of thing's been around for a while. But it's only recently that the mainstream Protestants and the Pentecostals will even talk. Because Pentecostals don't think much of the mainstream Protestants either. They actually found that they had more in common, and this is one of the things, and I think this is one of the reasons why under Pope John Paul II, he really ratcheted up the Marian devotions in charismatic movement, made her the patron of the charismatic movement, was because the Pentecostals and charismatic Catholics found a lot of common accord. And very often charismatic Catholics didn't always feel that welcome in their parishes because they were making a fuss. And so they would end up going to Pentecostal churches. And so that was one thing that happened under John Paul II, was he kind of sealed in the Catholicness of Catholic charismatic renewal. But that was definitely a place where there was interreligious dialogue. And the Pentecostals still like the charismatic Catholics all right. They don't like other varieties much, but they don't even like each other sometimes, and there's a lot of denominational, there's a lot of shared turf. Competition, I guess, would be the word. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Where does the popularity of like the Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists, because I've heard about those my whole life, I've never met any people, or rarely, but all over the place in Guatemala, El Salvador.
Yeah, and Mormons. That's the other, the other ones.
Are they part of the same phenomenon in some ways? Because I certainly meet people there that this turned their whole life around.
Yeah, well, I have a theory about Mormons in particular. And that is, Mormons believe in an additional revelation. They've got a whole different sacred text. And in this country, everybody thinks of Mormons as really different, including the Mormons. That they really are kind of a different ball game than everybody else. And so once you become a Mormon, you have sort of abandoned everything before. But in Latin America, this is also true of the Testigos and the Adventists. If you're coming out of a Catholic background in Latin America, you just see them as another variety of Protestant. And people are much more likely they'll church shop, and they'll move to a church that sort of suits them at that moment, and then go on to another one in a few years. And so once, leaving the Catholic Church is the big one. That's the big move. But once they move, then they'll switch a lot. And so someone will become a Jehovah's Witness, or they'll become a Mormon, and then they'll become something else. So it doesn't have that quality of differentness that it would have to us. The Adventists are big in Brazil. Of course, everybody's big in Brazil. Brazil is the biggest Catholic country in the world and the biggest Protestant country in the world. What a claim, right? Because it's a dadgum big country, and people are religious in Brazil, and there's a lot of overlap in Brazil. People will be a variety of different things in there, so you can have somebody who maybe belongs to 3 different religions. In Chiapas, one of the things that's really interesting, and this is actually interesting in the United States, but I think even though Pew included Hispanics in the United States on the survey as Latin Americans, I don't think it's quite the same. That's just my opinion about it. But in Chiapas, one of the things that's happened over the past 2 decades or so is people who became Protestants, became Pentecostals, and sort of went through a variety of that, have become Muslim. There were some Spanish Muslim missionaries that went to Chiapas, and some of them have now moved on. They just saw it as yet another religious variation and didn't really see it. Some of them are real Muslims, but they didn't necessarily see it as something that was as an extreme a conversion as we would. They just interpreted it as just another stop along the highway, I suppose.
Do you have time for another question?
One more. Or you're just exhausted by it. Be careful, I'll put more of Father Rossi on there if you don't watch out. Watch him all day.
I'm curious about then, if there's no other questions, I'm curious about the movement of Protestantism from converting those that are the dispossessed to becoming a religion of more the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
When did that occur? How did that occur?
Well, part of that is, that's a good question, something I just didn't even get into, in part because the terminology is not that useful. People who subscribe to prosperity theology are often called neo-Pentecostals. And they're the ones who are sort of more socially acceptable. That started in the 70s and 80s, like Rios Montt became a neo-Pentecostal. And he's he was president, and he's a general, and he's from an upper-class family. There's a social acceptability to neo-Pentecostalism, which is largely tied into this prosperity theology, that makes it appealing to people who aren't poor people. And the idea that you can sort of, that it's an aspirational religious expression, that that is something that's going to help you get ahead. One of the things that is interesting to me, and something I'm just beginning to kind of look at a little bit, is what happens to people who are adults now and grew up Pentecostal. That's very different from being a convert. And one of the things that does seem to be true in Guatemala and El Salvador, at least, is those second generation it may be Weberian actually, they are much more likely, because one of the things Pentecostals eventually have come to sort of push, even though they used to not, because they were all about the experience, is education. They're big about self-improvement. And you know, one of the things, if you quit drinking, you have a lot of time, and so they have these small groups, and they have Bible studies, classes, and then those will sort of evolve into, there's a pastor in Guatemala named Otto Caballeros, who's really, there's a book called Christian Citizenship in Guatemala that is about this very thing, but then they'll have a Bible study group that also sort of becomes something about how you put your money in a bank and how you can save money, and women, how they can sort of improve themselves from sort of basic literacy, and how you can take care of your kids in a more healthy way. And so there are all kinds of these small groups that focus on self-improvement, and they pray, they all pray. And so they pray for the community that they're in. It's their little community. They pray for themselves, but now they've adopted, in Guatemala anyway, the idea that they can pray the nation. You know, if prayer works, then why not give it all you've got and convert this country that's got so many problems. Although a few years ago I was at they invited me down to speak at this big, I didn't realize what it was till I got there, and it was this big meeting of Pentecostal pastors. And I thought, oh boy, this is, you know, the minute I heard the holy saxophone playing, I thought, oh man, I'm so doomed. But anyway, what they were interested in, a guy got up and he said, okay, he says, let's talk about this. We've been praying for all these years, and we've been trying to do this, and we've built schools, and we've done this and done that. And he said, how many more things do we need to do before this country changes? It's time to come up with some sort of hermeneutics of social justice. Because the Pentecostal idea of improving society historically has been evangelized, bring people into the church, change their lives, change that community, and then one by one, you'll reach this tipping point, and then everything will change. And he said that hadn't happened. And so it was about, they wanted to do it in a way that didn't smack of liberation theology. They were terrified it was going to sound that way, that they were going to meet in Bible study groups and apply the Bible to their lives. And then, so they were trying to come up with a way to sort of rebrand it in a Pentecostal way, if I can use that. And they're still working on it. I mean, it's very hard. It's something that, I mean, a lot of Pentecostals won't even belong, they won't even go to PTA, they won't go to any, this is especially true in El Salvador, they won't go to any kind of community organization that isn't involved with the church. They completely separate themselves from the world. They won't go to teacher conferences. You know, they won't help with the soup kitchen. And so they're trying to sort of, and I think that is actually a result of their experiences in the war and this sort of perceived binary between Protestants and radical Catholicism. But anyway, so that's a long and convoluted answer to a concise and clear question, but you know.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, thank you. Thank you, I've enjoyed this.